Hello and welcome to episode 305 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I am really good, Andy. I'm really positive because we've had a lot of really great feedback and interaction this week and since our last show. I mean, the piece I did on the Black Book was incredibly popular and had a lot of discussion online, not just in our Facebook group, but on the reviews that came in for the podcast. So I'm really pleased that people found that useful and have actually talked about their own versions that they're making of that particular Black Book. And as Justin mentioned in the group, there are some services out there that have areas where you can do something like this. One of them is Dropbox. So if you use Dropbox, they have an area where you can effectively create what I was describing, somewhere where you can lock stuff away that people can access if you're gone. So go into the Facebook group and you will find the thread, and Justin has put a link on there if you're interested. And an easier way perhaps to find it is if you go back onto our website and you look at the episode from last week, so that was 304, then there is a link to that thread in our Facebook group. But apart from that, Andy, I'm really positive because we've had some great feedback. I mean, I think you're going to name check somebody who wants to be name checked on the podcast.
Yeah, I have indeed. I've been chatting to Raj, who was really kind and sent an email across to the team to thank us for all that we do. So I'm just going to read out what he said here because he's acted on quite a few of the podcasts that we've done. And as you'll see when I read this out, I've been listening to the Money to the Masses podcast for the last 2 years. And recently my eyes lit up, especially on episode 283, the How to Become a Millionaire episode. I listened to it at least 3 times because of the amount of information in there. It really intrigued me, not just for myself, but for my children, that I can leave a pension behind for them, which could then be compounded for 40 plus years. So without Damien and Andy's podcast, I would not have known about this and been able to do it. All of you have been instrumental in helping us do this. I acted upon the information in the podcast and set up a junior SIP for my 13-year-old daughter. I'll also set up a pension for my son, who'll be 18 by the time that you get this review. We all thought we were money savvy, but alas, we were wrong. The team provide invaluable information. Keep up the great work and a massive thank you. And here's to many more podcasts. So that was from Raj, and I was blown away by that. It's really nice to know that the stuff we do, especially the stuff in the podcast where people are pausing it, playing it again, listening, taking notes, that's what we want. It's brilliant.
Yeah, and do leave your reviews. Send them in, but do leave them on iTunes or whatever app you use to listen to the podcast, because it helps other people see them and what you like about the podcast, and it helps, obviously, boost the podcast up the charts so more people can find it. And it is incredibly motivating to receive those emails because I share them with the rest of the team, and it's motivating for them, particularly people who join us and join the team, to see what it is that we really do, what's going on, the impact that we have with people in the wider world and our audience. The other thing before we move on, I tell you what's on the podcast. At the back end of last week's show, I set a challenge about direct debits for people to review their direct debits and their standing orders and see where they could cut them and save money, because it's something people should do, spring clean their direct debits. And Andy, we have a winner, quite a clear winner actually, because the amount that he has saved.
Yeah.
And his name is?
His name is George. And Damien, do you want me to reveal what George did and how much he was able to save?
Definitely.
So we got a message from George to say, "Hi Damien, I had a feeling I was probably spending too much on my coffee and tea subscriptions. So I did what you said. And once I looked, I saw that I had a mixture of monthly, quarterly and annual subscriptions. And I was quite shocked to realise that over 5 retailers, I could save a whopping £650 per year. A few of the companies tried to sweet talk him into staying with them, but he held his ground, and he's glad he did. And he said, thank you, I'm now back in control. So George has saved £650 a year by cutting out those wasteful coffee subscriptions that he doesn't need. So I think that's brilliant. A clear winner, I have to say.
Yeah, a clear winner. We had a number of entries, obviously, but George's was a standout. Also because we all seem to have a coffee problem at Money to the Masses, and ours is pales into insignificance in comparison to George's, which made us feel a lot better. So I did ask him what he's going to put in the mug, but he's still drinking coffee and tea, but probably not in such quantities as he was before. So well done, George. The mug is on its way to you. So now, what is on this week's podcast? I've got 3 pieces, an investment piece I want to talk about. Now, we've had the inauguration this week in America. So Joe Biden is now the president of the United States. And I want to do a piece on the first 100 days of a president's office. So what happens to the stock market during that period? Because a lot of analysts obsess about it and try to predict what's going to happen. So I want to give people some insight into that. I also want to talk about drawdown and something in particular called investment pathways, which is a change that's coming in at the start of February. So it's in a couple of weeks. But I think it's worthwhile people knowing about the changes that are going to come in. And this is about if you decide to go into drawdown or move a pension into drawdown to another provider, you will encounter something called investment pathways. But there's some interesting insights for people who are already in drawdown or thinking about doing it from what the FCA has now stipulated has to happen. And finally, I want to talk about when you no longer need life insurance. And it was inspired by the idea of people going down and looking at direct debits. And I don't want people cancelling life insurance because people might be sitting there thinking, well, that cost me X amount a month. I don't need that. So I want to do a piece on when you no longer need life insurance.
Good stuff. So I'm assuming we want to start with the main piece, really, talking about US President Joe Biden and his first 100 days in office.
Yeah, the first 100 days in office seems to be a number that analysts are attracted to, but not even just analysts. Joe Biden himself has come out and said, for example, he wants to administer, not himself personally, but 100 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. And this 100-day period is often looked at as a key period where the new president gets his feet, I would love to say his or her feet, but they've obviously never had a female president, but they get their feet under the desk and change things and move things forward. And obviously Joe Biden signed a lot of executive orders in the first 24 hours. So you can see there's a lot of momentum that happens at the start of a new presidency. And to emphasize that, you can actually find, for example, the Wall Street Journal did a 100-second video covering what had happened in the first 100 days of Trump's presidency. So if you go back to 2017, you will find this video. I mean, there's whole articles about what goes on in people's first 100 days. And it's quite an interesting video, actually. It's a very fast-paced video because obviously a lot went on, not all of it particularly positive. And so what happens to the stock market is quite interesting in that first 100 days. So if we look at what happened in Donald Trump's first 100 days in office, the S&P 500 rose 5%. And of course, by osmosis, those rallies are largely reflected around the globe because obviously there's a sense of optimism. If you go back to episode 285 of the Money to the Masses podcast, I did a whole piece about what to expect with the US election and your investments, what it could mean. And I listened to it actually ahead of this podcast, and it's worth listening to again, just in that way of listening to something that was obviously based on history, insight, what could happen once the election had occurred. And of course, there were some interesting bits that didn't come true, but also some bits that did come true. But one of the things that I pointed out in that podcast was that it didn't particularly matter who became president in terms of the party, so whether it's Republican or Democrat. What mattered more was the underlying economic conditions in determining how the stock market performed during a presidency, so a whole presidential term. The party wasn't the biggest influencing factor, it's what was going on in the backdrop. So obviously with Biden, there's a lot of enthusiasm. I mean, on Wednesday itself, the S&P 500 rallied, and it was the biggest gain on Inauguration Day since Ronald Reagan. So it just shows you the sense of enthusiasm that's out there and people thinking that this is going to be like a bullish Biden trade and everyone's jumping on board, buy equities. But what does history tell us about those first 100 days? If you go back and look, there are a range of outcomes in terms of the percentage increase, but there appears at first glance to be a definite trend. So if we go back, for example, Donald Trump's first 100 days, the S&P 500 rose 5%. Barack Obama, both his terms, it was 6.5% and 8.5% were the two increases in the S&P 500. George W. Bush, actually, the first 100 days saw the S&P 500 fall, and that was in his second term by 1.6%, and in his first term it was by a whopping 6.9%. And then if we go back through Clinton's first terms and George Bush, so George Bush Sr., he also had a positive 8% rally in his first 100 days, and Reagan had positive outcomes in his first 100 days. So going back, you actually see that it was George W. Bush is the outlier, and he accounts for the only 2 negative returns in the first 100 days of the last 10 presidencies. And that would seem to suggest at first glance that, well, 8 out of 10 instances, there's an 80% chance that the market will rally during Biden's first 100 days because the market loves a president. It doesn't have to be a new president, as in it could be an incumbent president coming back. They just like a bit of ceremony. They like an inauguration, so they like to have another term of presidency. And the reality is, if you go and look at any 100-day period on the S&P 500 going back 40 years, then the market actually rises 75% of the time. Now, if you compare that to the 8 out of 10 I just mentioned, then you realise that really it's probably got nothing to do with the fact that there's a new president or that there's another term starting, that the market has rallied in each of those occasions that I've mentioned. It's actually just down to the fact you've picked a 100-day period. So reality is, if you dig below the data, realistically, the odds are in favour of the market rallying in the next 100 days, because that's just what markets do. They tend to go up over time, and the longer you pick the time frame, the more certainty you have. Do you remember in a recent podcast I was talking about that over a 20-year period? Then it's 100% certainty based on history. So don't just listen to the headlines you hear out there and all about what's going to happen under Biden and using past history. It's that idea that correlation doesn't mean causation. And so when you analyze anything in investing, do bear in mind, is this really what's driving this pattern? Compare it to basically almost a placebo, something where there isn't a president or a new presidency. So what is likely to be driving it is, as I mentioned in podcast 285, it's really what the president has inherited. So the economic backdrop. So in each of these occasions, you can pick a reason why the market has gone higher. If you think about George W. Bush, in one of his terms, he pretty much inherited the dot-com bubble bursting. But equally, people are still keen to try and draw out some kind of causation in all of this. They've even looked at the first 5 trading days after an election and tried to say, well, was there some influence on markets? And when you look at it, Joe Biden seemed to drive the stock market higher than any of the last 10 presidencies by 5.2%. That's how much the stock market rallied. If you look at each of the last 10 terms, so both Reagan's terms, going back both Obama's terms, the first 5 trading days, he has had more. In fact, most of them actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1 and 2, 6 have actually fallen in the first 5 trading days. So it doesn't seem to have any influence about what's going to happen over the longer term. But more importantly, you have to remember that when Biden came into power, there was obviously this surge of optimism, but we also had a COVID-19 vaccine get announced. That was probably one of the biggest drivers of markets of late. There is the optimism about Joe Biden, but it was also because of the COVID-19 vaccine coming along. So like I say, that backdrop, the macro, so in this instance, it's COVID-19 vaccine, which hopefully will boost economic growth. So while there is optimism around Joe Biden, we do have to put it into a bit of perspective. I mean, going back to that episode of 285 of the podcast, if you listen to it, it was quite interesting. Even I raised an eyebrow when I listened to it, because at the point I made that podcast, which was in August, I was looking at the return on bonds and equities and suggested that there would be potentially another 5% upside in US equities until the end of the year. And it turns out after the election, that's exactly what happened. The market rallied 5.82% after the election. So that I thought that was quite a good pat on the back. Like I say, there are other things that didn't come true as well. But that rally that we had for Biden was also significantly large compared to all those other presidencies that I mentioned before. So it was the largest one we've had. And in fact, the market is up. So the S&P 500, that is up about 7.8% since the election result came out. So it just shows you that there is already been a bit of a Biden bounce. It has also been entwined with what's happening with the vaccine trade, so the optimism surrounding potential economic growth going forward. But I want people to be careful about looking at patterns and drawing conclusions when the cause of the rally could be something quite different. And also for people who are thinking today, I'm going to jump on the Biden rally, then actually, based on the figures I've just mentioned, a lot of the Biden rally is probably occurred already up to this point. It doesn't mean the market can't go higher, but it doesn't mean the reason the market will go higher is just purely because of Biden, although there are lots of positive reasons like the stimulus that he's announced. But don't forget, COVID is still in the background. That is one of the drivers of markets at the moment. And if we get a worse second wave, a third wave or whatever, that will have an influence on markets. So the first 100 days of a presidency are interesting, but to be honest with you, they are pretty much just like any other 100 days in equity markets.
Okay, so moving on to pension pathways. What is it? It's coming in February, right?
Yeah, so I don't talk about things on the podcast till they become basically reality or inevitable. So potential rule changes or anything like that, I don't tend to talk about them when they are a potential, because firstly, they might not happen, and secondly, people might forget about them when they actually get to the point that they become implemented. So the investment pathways is a bit like that. So as of February this year, so it's 2021, there are changes afoot in the way that consumers will interact with pension providers. And this is particular to people who are going into drawdown. So what's happened is that from the 1st of February, there are a set of FCA rules that come into effect that say that pension providers have to automatically give solutions to non-advised drawdown customers. And that means, there's a definition of what that actually is, but in very simple terms, broad terms, it's people who haven't had advice in the last 12 months relating to this particular topic. And the reason why this is coming in is because non-advised drawdown customers, when they did some research, they were found to be unsure of where their pension is invested. So just to give people a reminder, if you want to go back and find out what drawdown is, go back to episode 271 of this podcast. But in simple terms, when you get to retirement and you have a defined contribution pension and you decide that you want to start taking an income or a lump sum, this will involve you going into what is known as drawdown. So you end up drawing on your pension. And I'm not going to go into the full details of how it works. Like I say, you can listen to podcast episode 271. But in accessing your pension benefits, you are going to have to make decisions about what amount of money you want, but the income you might decide that you want. Do you want it now? And how you're going to derive that income, the method, but also how you're going to produce that via the investments that are in your pension. So, for example, a SIP. But what the FCA found is that when people went into drawdown, they were unsure of the pension investments that they had. They also found that the investment choices that people had made didn't align with their objectives in retirement. So, for example, somebody might decide they want to take some money out of their pension, and in doing so they end up moving into drawdown. As I say, listen to episode 271 for the nuances of how it works. But they didn't actually make any choice about what was going to then happen with that money in drawdown. And so it was just left as cash because the person had achieved their short-term aim, where it might be accessing some of the money in their pension. So they hadn't really thought about it properly. So the FCA, in fairness, I think it's a good idea. And what they've done is they've become very prescriptive with pension providers and said, look, in the instance where somebody designates part of all of their fund to drawdown, or they move from drawdown to drawdown, like make a transfer, for example, between providers, then the providers are going to have to provide investment pathways. And the result is that it's going to give people an option of a default fund, or they're going to have to actually make an active decision to stay in cash. So the provider needs to get an active decision from the customer that they want to stay in cash, but with the understanding of the impacts of inflation. This is very different to a lot of the other stuff that you might see the FCA do, where they might provide rules that can be a bit woolly, that people have to steer between. In this instance, they've stipulated what providers have to do. And the reason why this is interesting for everybody, even if you're not near drawdown or you're thinking maybe you might retire in the future, you could already be in drawdown, in fact, is because of what they stipulate people have to consider and the pathway for providers, like a decision tree almost. This is useful for anybody who at the moment might be in drawdown or who might be thinking about retiring. So I've covered the when and effectively what and why. Now, how it works is that effectively, if you are one of those people where you decide to designate part of your fund or all of it into a drawdown, or you make a transfer, then the provider will have to engage with you. And I'm going to run through very quickly just a very simple, almost decision tree, which all of the providers will have had to base their journey upon. So from the 1st of February, if you are one of those people who trigger this pathway process, what will happen is you will be asked to pick an investment choice, and then you can choose your own investments, or if you are already in drawdown, then you can stick with your current investments, because somebody could already be technically have part of their fund in drawdown and can trigger the process, this pathway process, if they decide to move more of their fund into drawdown. So what will happen is you will be asked to pick your investment choice. Now, you can decide to choose your investments, or you can stick with your current ones. Now, if you decide to stick with your current one, then they will remind customers to check their investment strategy meets their current investment objectives. Then at that point, and this is obviously for people who decide they want to choose investments, the customer, if they're holding more than 50% in cash or cash-like investments, then the platform will engage with them, and they will have to get an active decision from the customer that they want to invest in cash. And they have to obviously give them warnings about the sort of risks to their fund being eroded by inflation, for example. But obviously for a lot of people who might want to go into drawdown, they won't have a view on investment. So what's going to happen? They're going to go down this investment pathways route. And the FCA has stated they will fall into one of these 4 categories. So you can select that I have no plans to touch my money in the next 5 years. Option 2 will be I plan to set up a guaranteed income in the next 5 years. Option 3, I plan to start taking a long-term income within the next 5 years. And option 4, I plan to take out all of my money in the next 5 years. And what's interesting now is that providers are going to have to give people a solution to each of those. So if you listen back to that, you can put yourself in one of those buckets if you are planning to retire soon, or if you're already in drawdown. And so from the 1st of February, providers are going to have to give a solution to this. And it will be, in most cases, it will be just a single fund solution. And if you go, for example, I was looking at Fidelity's solution that they've already announced and shown what those 4 funds will be for those specific needs. Once they obviously give them this solution, present it, they have to disclose the risks, they have to explain to people that they can shop around, and they obviously, again, like I mentioned, they have to allow people to tell them they can choose their own investment funds, but they also have to point them to the Money and Pension Service tool that's going to be out that allows people to basically shop around. So you can see that the FCA has done something which I think on the whole is a very positive thing, because it's engaging people with the importance of drawdown, because they realise that there are a growing number of non-advised customers out there who are using platforms to manage their own retirement, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they are not thinking about the long term. So these solutions are a positive step in my mind, that they are forcing people to think about their retirement and how they're going to manage it. And just to mention on the cash point, because obviously there's a big emphasis on the idea that people sit in cash. If somebody was prompted, for example, that their drawdown fund is more than 50% of it is in cash, then the next year they'll be prompted again. And there's going to be this ongoing element to these rules where people need to be warned about the dangers of having too much money in cash. And also they'll be prompted to consider whether they've deviated from the option that they chose. So let's say, for example, someone said that they're planning to not access their money, but they then start accessing it, then the SIP provider or the pension provider is going to have to start communicating with that person to say, well, you've deviated from what you said you would do. You need to review your options. So this is all a positive. The negative, obviously, is that we're in the world of default funds, and people know my view on default funds generally. So they're going to have to ensure that these default funds are going to actually deliver on the objectives. And the idea of having potentially your whole drawdown fund in one fund is, to me, a little bit worrying, because I would personally never do that. It kind of seems to goes against that idea of diversification, for example. And I know the funds will presumably be diversified in some way, but it doesn't obviously replace the benefits of seeking financial advice. And I'm out there saying that seeking financial advice is probably the most important when you get to this, what they call decumulation phase, when you start to access your pension benefits. So with all these things, obviously, I think it's best to get advice from an independent financial advisor, but this is going to be proved useful for consumers. But it does still impact financial advisors as well, because going forward, they're obviously going to have to consider what the advice they're giving is better than what's going to be on offer via the pathway, so the default option. Of course, if an advisor is any good, it inevitably will be that their advice will be better, because, like I said, a single fund solution I don't personally believe is a fantastic thing. But I want people to take away that this has come on board now. This is here. It provides some great information if you want to do research into the possible options and what you might want to be doing, even ahead of getting advice if you decide to go down the advice route, and how those 4 different solutions from a provider, and look at different providers. Like I say, there's the comparison tool that I mentioned. You can shop around, look at those default funds, see how they're invested, because they're trying to achieve those 4 different objectives that I mentioned. So it's good news, and also use it to be able to inform yourself about funding and managing your retirement.
Okay, and moving on to the last piece then, and we're talking about life insurance and when you no longer need it. Damien, you stipulated earlier, no one should be just willy-nilly cancelling life insurance, but there are things that you can do to check, aren't there?
Yeah, I know what you mean, because unfortunately there's been evidence out there that are worried about people who are doing that, because I get the fact that if things get tough because of the economic backdrop, that people will want to sort of start cutting back. And as I mentioned last week, it's good to do a spring cleaning of your finances, but I don't want people willy-nilly getting rid of life insurance, because one of the things is that life insurance over time becomes more expensive, because if you want to take out a policy, let's say you've got a life insurance policy that you took out in your 30s, then by the time you're probably in your 40s or 50s, you're not only older, so unfortunately, statistically, you're more likely to die because of your age, and also because of health conditions you probably got. So if you go to take out life insurance for a particular term, you'll find it's more expensive. So if people suddenly cancel a life insurance policy and then decide, later down the line, I really needed that policy, then it's going to be much more expensive than it was before. So, for example, I've got a life insurance policy that relates to my mortgage, and that was taken out when I was a sprightly 29-year-old. And obviously now I'm not, I'm in my early 40s. If I took out a policy, it would be more expensive, plus with the health issues that I've had in the interim period. If I'd wanted to take out a policy to cover my mortgage now, it would be more expensive. So you don't want to just cancel willy-nilly, and also you don't know that the policy you're going to get is going to be as good as the one that you necessarily cancelled. On that, just quickly, if you accidentally cancel a life insurance policy and you're sitting here thinking, blimey, I think I did that, you do have usually a period of grace where you can go back to the insurance company, and if you've only missed a few premiums, you can repay them. They will set it up, and then the policy will continue as if you never did cancel them. And obviously that's because every now and then direct debits do inadvertently fail for some reason, and so you can, if you've cancelled one, go back and reinstate it, but be quick if you've done that. So what I wanted to do is to get people to think about, before they cancel a direct debit, why do they have the policy? And it's actually a useful exercise anyway, because you should really review your insurance needs. So this isn't just life insurance. I'm talking about things like income protection, possibly critical illness, every 5 years. And also in particular, if you have life events, say you bought a property, took out a mortgage, you might have got married, or you had children. They're all reasons to reconsider the sort of insurances that you have. Now, one of the things you might be looking at a policy and think, do I really need it? Do work out why you took it out in the first place. But going forward, the reasons to not have a policy, it's probably easy if you just think about the reasons to keep one, or why one would be useful. And I'm going to just run through a bunch of them very quickly. And one of them is to do with inheritance tax. So you may have a policy that is useful for paying off inheritance tax, but your estate or asset situation may have changed. So you may need more insurance or less insurance, for example. And that's a reason to reconsider. So some people take out insurances, for example, to pay an inheritance tax bill so their estate isn't diminished. So that's why they would have them in place. So reconsider that. Obviously, whether you need to support dependents. If you no longer need to support dependents for some reason because your life circumstances have changed, then yeah, you may no longer have a requirement for an insurance policy that was once in place, but you need to consider that carefully. But you may have new dependents. You may have children that have come along, so you might need to review that. Also, do bear in mind about debts. So insurance policies can be very useful and be put in place to help clear debts. I'm not just talking about mortgages, but if debts have been cleared over time, then again, that might change the situation. Don't forget about things like funeral expenses. That's something people overlook. Funerals are expensive. And also there are people who have a policy in place because they want to provide a lump sum, almost like a nest egg of some kind, because they want to give that to somebody. Now, you might want to reconsider whether you still want to do that, or whether you actually have never thought about it but want to provide that. And another one is, I think business protection gets overlooked a lot. And if you run a business, then you might want to make sure you consider business protection. We've done it on the podcast before. But also, if you have a policy that's in place, because it may be for like shareholder protection, so you may have other directors within your business that own shares within the business, that you might want to ensure that your partner is basically paid out from the business in a roundabout way if you were to die, so they would benefit. That policy, that shareholder protection policy, is really important. So if you just cancel that because it's expensive, then you've just left your family exposed to financial hardship. So those are some quick reasons why you may no longer need life insurance, but actually the reasons why you should. So I always think that people should really think carefully about cancelling life insurance. And if you don't know whether you should or shouldn't, go seek advice. Now, protection advice, if you go and see a protection specialist, they will give you advice, and the advice is free in inverted commas, because they get paid by the insurance companies via commission. Commission is still allowed in the insurance world. So that's how they're paid. So you're not charged for the advice they give you. They're basically paid by the insurance company if you take out a policy. So you can have a conversation with an insurance specialist, and it may be, if they're good, they will review your situation. It may be they won't necessarily try and sell you anything if they're any good. They will just look at your situation, be objective, tell you if you need more, if you don't, and then you can make an informed decision before you randomly start cancelling direct debits.
Okay, so that's it. We're done again for this week. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with a number 2. And we always say it, but do head over to our Facebook group if you haven't done so already. There has been loads of questions this week, and I think we've had a record week for people joining the group as well. So there's always stuff in there that you can either learn about or post your questions. So it's facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. And again, as we said at the start of the podcast, if you can find time, just 2 minutes to review the podcast, it really helps us to go up the charts and help more people. Damien, we're done for this week.
Yeah, we are done. And just to emphasise on the reviews, it just ensures that Andy and I come back next week and do another show. So please do review it. So that's it for this week. Until next time.